I'm a child of the 80s. In 1980, I was 10 years old, which means I spent that entire glorious decade growing from a child to an adult. There was so much wonder and amazement happening back then. To this day, I consider growing up in that era one of my greatest blessings. If you weren't alive to see it, do yourself a favor. Spend an entire afternoon watching the golden days of MTV. You'll soon understand why we were all in such a good mood. But beneath the neon and synth pop, there was a shadow growing. I remember being 13 when my father came into my room holding a church bulletin. This wasn't unusual since my family went to Mass most Sundays and did the fish fries during Lent. It was normal. But this bulletin was different. Inside was a watch list, a manifest of records, books, and movies that parents were told to keep away from their children at all costs. Now, my dad was beyond cool. He was the kind of man who wanted his son to explore the world and discover things for himself. He didn't come storming into my room to rain down church justice. He just wanted to see what I was into. The problem was, my entire collection of books, records, and games was on that list. The music section alone was a who's who of my shelf. Iron Maiden, Dio, Judas Priest, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Ozzy. You know, the good stuff. And the books, pretty much anything by Stephen King. And then came the movies. Halloween, Friday the 13th, The Exorcist. Basically, the essential starter kit for any 13-year-old kid in the 80s. My dad looked at me and said, "What the hell's going on here, son? Is this stuff all satanic?" I picked up the list from the church bulletin and read it for a second, and I just started laughing. And when my old man asked what was so funny, I said, "Dad, you have like 15 of these records in your own collection." I watched his face when he realized I was right. I told him, "I'll give up my Iron Maiden when you give up your Led Zeppelin." He looked at me with a grin that made him look like a teenager and said, "I'm not giving up my Zeppelin records." We had a good laugh, and I walked away with a memory that I'll cherish forever. But for most kids, this wasn't a joke. I went to school and heard the horror stories about parents raiding their kids' bedroom and handing over their record collections to be burned in church parking lots during these so-called cleansing the youth rallies. So I took it upon myself to become a crusader of our culture, a one-man resistance against this holy hysteria. I recorded unmarked blank cassette tapes of my music stash for friends whose parents had gone off the deep end. This rebellion immediately caught on in school, and soon we were all trading bootleg tapes of our records. I ended up with way more music than I had started with, all while giving a giant middle finger to the oppressive establishment. Plus, we were all listening to these tapes with our new Sony Walkmans, so the parents who handed over their kids' music to the church had no idea they were still listening to it in plain sight. It was glorious. Then came Dungeons and Dragons, which caused the church to absolutely lose its holy mind. They held special masses claiming this simple tabletop game was enlisting children into Satan's army. I love it, as you can clearly see. My parents, thankfully, saw it for what it was, a game that made their son love reading and math. Our house soon became a haven for the satanic, simply because we like to roll dice and tell stories about orcs. To my knowledge, none of my friends ever committed a crime in the name of the devil, though we did slay quite a few dragons. But the panic went far beyond my neighborhood. It was on almost every nightly newscast. Stories of animal sacrifices, cattle mutilations, and black masses in the woods were spreading like wildfire. Not far from my house was this little stone building built in the 1700s called the Quaker Church. A rumor had started that a cult used this place for satanic rituals. So we'd go out there all the time, hoping to see something crazy, But the only people we ever found out there were other kids doing the same stupid things that we were doing. Being a writer, even back then, I helped fuel those rumors. I made up goofy stories to scare my friends, and for some reason, people believed me. I'm glad I could give them a good scare. It's what I still do today with my books over at chilledbones.com. Link in the description. If you remember this period, you're probably laughing right now, but the laughter stops when you realize how deep this hole actually went. Tonight, we're going to dive beneath the surface of a decade gripped by a collective fever dream and expose the rest of the Satanic Panic Iceberg. Tier 1. When you look back at the early 1980s, it's easy to dismiss the Satanic Panic as a joke. We look at the fashion, the hair, the heavy synth pop soundtracks, and we laugh. But if you were a teenager in the 1980s, the laughter was often drowned out by the static of a television set broadcasting absolute terror into your living room night after night. Tier 1 of our iceberg isn't about deep state conspiracies or forensic evidence. It's about the cultural contagion. It's about how the fear of the occult moved from the fringes of the religious right into the center of the American dinner table. Let's start with the obsession that personally fueled my happy childhood. Dungeons and Dragons. If you're a gamer today, it's hard to imagine that a game involving polyhedral dice, paper character sheets, and a vivid imagination was once labeled the recruitment manual for Satan. In the early 80s, the religious establishment identified D&D as the primary gateway for teenagers to enter the occult. The logic, if you can remotely call it that, was that by role-playing as a wizard or a cleric, a child was performing actual spellcasting. Like spells actually exist. Sermons were preached warning parents that if they saw their kids drawing maps or shouting about rolling initiative, they were witnessing a transgression into dark magic. The panic surrounding D&D reached its absolute fever pitch when it was tied to the tragic cases of some teenagers who took their own lives. Rather than looking for the systemic causes of adolescent depression or social isolation, it was far easier for the media to point a finger at the box containing the game and say, "This is why." The game became a scapegoat for a generation's anxiety. To this day, I still play D&D every Wednesday night, and I haven't felt a tinge of demonic possession yet. But the game was only the beginning. The next target was the music. If the parents couldn't stop the D&D games, they could certainly take the records. This was the era of the parental advisory label's infancy, long before it was a sticker on a CD. Groups like the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, began identifying the Filthy 15, a list of songs they claimed were poisoning the minds of American youth. And the fear went far beyond just bad words. This was the era of this weird thing called backmasking. I remember friends sitting for hours with their record players, spinning vinyl in reverse, convinced that if they slowed it down enough, they would hear Judas Priest or Led Zeppelin commanding them to serve the devil. It sounds absurd now, but at the time, this was a legitimate news topic. Networks were bringing on experts who claimed that the human brain could subconsciously decode these backwards messages, effectively programming children to engage in satanic rituals. It wasn't about the music anymore. It was about the idea that our own entertainment was a Trojan horse for a sinister external force. This is hard to believe, but for a period in the 1980s, the company that made your soup and toothpaste was the subject of a massive nationwide boycott because people were convinced their logo, which featured the man in the moon and 13 stars, was a hidden satanic sigil. The theory claimed that the number of stars represented the original colonies, but that arrangement was a coded message for Satanism. and that the CEO had supposedly appeared on the Phil Donahue show to confess his allegiance to the Church of Satan. None of this was true. Procter & Gamble sued dozens of people for libel, but the rumor spread like a virus. It didn't need to be true to be spread. It survived for years, proving that in the time of the panic, people didn't need evidence. They just needed a villain. And then there was this undisputed king of hysteria, the Geraldo Rivera specials. In 1988, Geraldo Rivera hosted a primetime special titled Devil Worship Exposing Satan's Underground. If you want to understand the peak of the Satanic Panic, watch that broadcast. It was sensationalistic, unhinged, and it was the most watched television event of its kind. Geraldo talked about millions of teenage devil worshippers running in the woods, committing animal sacrifices, and planning a revolution. This special was the master narrative of the surface level of the Satanic Panic Iceberg. It took the scattered fears about D&D, rock music, and weird symbols, and it wove them into a single, cohesive horror story. It told the American public that their kids were not just safe or unsafe, they were under siege. It provided intel for the paranoia that would soon lead to the events in Tier 2 of this iceberg. This level of the iceberg, the surface, was the training ground. It taught the public how to look for the enemy in the most mundane places: a game, a record sleeve, a corporate logo, or a television talk show. By the time the news cycles finished with these topics, the groundwork had been laid. The public was conditioned to believe that danger was hidden everywhere. As we look at the surface level, it's easy to laugh. We see the absurdity of banning Iron Maiden and fearing the laundry detergent logo. But we have to look past the absurdity. We're actually looking at a case study in how society builds a monster. It didn't take high-tech wizardry or genuine occult ritual to create the panic. It took a moral framework that was eager for a war and a media machine that was hungry for a scandal. By the end of the 1980s, the surface had convinced an entire nation that the boogeyman wasn't just in the movies. He was in the basement, in the classroom, and worst of all, he was currently playing in the neighbor's living room. Tier 2, the shallows, the institutional invasions. If Tier 1 was the drumbeat of fear rattling the windows of every suburban home, Tier 2 is the moment the authorities kicked the door in, tripped over the welcome mat, and started arresting the furniture. We're moving away from the cultural hysteria of bad hair and backwards records and entertaining the institutional invasions. This is where the panic stopped being a hobby for bored church groups and became a wrecking ball handled by people with badges, clipboards, and dangerously high levels of self-righteous indignation. The catalyst for this shift was a little piece of literary fiction masquerading as biography. Michelle Remembers. Published in 1980, this book was written by Michelle Smith and her psychiatrist, Lawrence Pazder, who, in a twist that definitely isn't a conflict of interest at all, later married her. The book claimed to be the harrowing true story of Smith's childhood, where she was allegedly kidnapped and tortured by a global satanic cult. It introduced the world to recovered memory therapy, the convenient psychological theory that you can totally forget years of ritualistic trauma until a therapist with a leading question helps you remember it. To the public, this was the smoking gun. To anyone with a functioning bullshit detector, it was a creative writing project gone rogue. There was zero physical evidence. None. No bodies, no secret temples, not even a stray black candle. But for the SRA, Satanic Ritual Abuse Movement, it was the Holy Grail. It gave social workers and prosecutors a cheat sheet on what to look for. And unfortunately, if you look hard enough for monsters in a dark room, your brain will eventually start drawing them on the walls. This brings us to the McMartin preschool trial, which remains a masterclass in how to set millions of dollars on fire while ruining lives. It started with a single unverified accusation from a mother who was, I don't know, let's say, not exactly a stable witness. But instead of performing a standard investigation, the authorities decided to go full Salem. They hired child experts who interviewed the kids using techniques that were about as scientific as a Ouija board. They asked leading questions like, did the teachers take you into the secret underground tunnels? Or did you see them fly in the hot air balloons? When the kids, who were toddlers, mind you, said no, the interviewers would tell them they were being bad or that they'd be in trouble if they didn't tell the truth. Eventually, the kids started telling the adults exactly what they wanted to hear. They described the secret rooms under the school and rituals that would have required a Marvel movie budget to pull off. The trial was the longest and most expensive in U.S. history. It bankrupted a family business and left a community traumatized. Not by Satanists, but by the people who were supposedly protecting you from them. Then there was the recovered memory gold rush. Suddenly, every expert in the country was a specialist in uncovering repressed trauma. If you had a headache, it wasn't stress. It was probably a suppressed memory of a hooded figure. If you had a dream about a goat, congratulations, you were a ritual survivor. It was a psychiatric feedback loop. The legal system, which is theoretically built on innocent until proven guilty, decided to pivot to guilty because a hypnotized person said so. And then, of course, we have the West Memphis Three. By 1993, the panic was a well-oiled machine. When three young boys were tragically murdered in Arkansas, the police didn't exactly exhaust themselves looking for forensic evidence. Why bother with DNA when you have a kid in town who wears a Metallica shirt? They targeted Damien Eccles and his friends because they looked the part. They were alternative. They read Stephen King. They were essentially the kids that I hung out with, but in a town that had been marinating in tier 1 of this iceberg hysteria for a decade. The prosecution didn't have a weapon, a motive, or a shred of physical evidence linking the teens to the crime. What they did have was a black trench coat and a copy of the Satanic Bible. In a sane world, that's a fashion choice and a boring read. In 1993 Arkansas, it was a one-way ticket to death row. These guys spent nearly 20 years in prison, not because of what they did, but because they didn't fit the good old boy aesthetic of their own town. The shallow end of this iceberg is actually terrifying because it's so human. It wasn't the devil who put innocent people in jail. It was social workers, judges, and so-called experts who were so convinced they were heroes that they didn't care who they stepped on to get their trophy. They didn't report the panic. They institutionalized it. They traded the truth for a terrifying bedtime story because it felt better to fight a phantom than to admit they had no idea what they were doing. As we move into Tier 3, the stories stop being legally tragic and start getting straight up weird. We're talking underground tunnel networks that supposedly span the country and theories involving the government that would make even a sci-fi writer say, okay, that's a bit much. Tier 3, the Midnight Zone, high strangeness and the science of fear. Welcome to the Midnight Zone. Now, we're entering the part of the iceberg where the logic completely detaches from the hull and floats off into deep space. This is where the Satanic Panic stopped being a social movement and started sounding like a collaborative fan fiction project written by people who had stayed up far too long watching The X Files and reading the back of Drano bottles. In Tier 3, the Satanists were no longer just a group of weirdos in the woods. They were a global, high tech, multi generational organization with better logistics than Amazon and more secret bases than a Bond villain. The first stop in this fever dream is the high tech underground. During the preschool trials of Tier 2, the stories were already pushing it. But in Tier 3, the claims became a full blown obsession. Experts and survivors began claiming that under every suburban strip mall and daycare center, there was a vast network of subterranean ritual chambers. These weren't just damp basements. We're talking high tech facilities with elevators, surgical suites for ritualistic breeding, and, my personal favorite, teleportation pads. Because, of course, if you're a Satanist in the 1980s, you aren't just carpooling in a Chevy Nova, you're beaming into the local Pizza Hut basement to sacrifice a goat. The absolute best part? Investigators actually brought in ground penetrating radar to scan the dirt under these schools. They found absolutely nothing. But in the world of self righteous indignation, no evidence is just proof the Satanists are really good at filling in the holes with magic dirt or using cloaking technology. Then we have the MK Ultra Project Monarch crossover. This is where the Satanic Panic met the world of deep state conspiracy. Theorists began claiming that the satanic ritual abuse wasn't just for fun, it was government sanctioned mind control. The idea was that the cults, who were apparently also CIA contractors, would use trauma to shatter a child's mind into multiple personalities, or alters. As a writer, I have to appreciate the creativity here. They claimed they were creating Manchurian candidates who could be activated by a code word to perform assassinations or presumably deliver occult messages. They even claimed the government was using Disney movies, specifically Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz, as programming triggers. So, if you liked a movie about a girl in a blue dress, congratulations. You were probably a sleeper agent in the New World Order. But wait, it gets weirder. Now let's talk about the gray connection. In the early 90s, the Venn diagram of people who believe in satanic cults and people who believe in alien abductions became a perfect circle. Some fringe researchers started noticing that the descriptions of alien abductions, being taken into a cold, sterile room, being poked with needles, having missing time, sounded a lot like the satanic ritual abuse stories. Instead of concluding that maybe both groups were influenced by the same pop culture tropes, they decided that the aliens and Satanists were the same thing. They claimed Greys were actually demons using biosuits, or conversely, that the Satanists were using alien technology to facilitate their rituals. At this point, the iceberg has essentially turned into a sci fi screenplay that even a B movie producer would find a bit much. And then there's the Satanic Bible in the penal system. During this tier, the panic moved into the prisons. There was a genuine movement to ban Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible from cell blocks, not because it was dangerous, but because the authorities were terrified that the inmates would use it to form super cults. Look, I've read LaVey. He's basically Ayn Rand with more eyeliner and a cape. It's mostly about being an edgy individualist. But the self-righteous indignation of the era transformed it into a manual for supernatural insurrection. They honestly thought that if a guy in a cell read a book about indulgence, He'd suddenly developed the power to pass through walls and start a dark uprising in the cafeteria. The horror of Tier 3 isn't the Satanism, it's the total collapse of reality. This is what happens when you give people a narrative of abuse evil and tell them they're the only ones who can see it. They stop looking for facts and start looking for lore. They create a world where everything is a sign. Every move is a trigger, and every hole in the ground is a gateway to a secret ritual chamber. It's the ultimate unreliable narrator scenario. The experts of the 80s and 90s weren't just investigating crimes, they were world building. They were writing a massive collective horror epic where they were the heroes and everybody else was a potential sleeper agent. When you get this deep, the truth doesn't matter anymore. The story is too good, too scary, and too profitable to let go. But as we're about to see in Tier 4, the real abyss isn't a high-tech tunnel or a gray alien in a cloak. The real abyss is much, much closer to home. It's us. Now that we've laughed at the teleporting Satanists and the MK Ultra Disney triggers, it's time to look at the wreckage left behind. Tier 4, the abyss, the darkness of human nature. We finally reached the bottom. We've laughed at the idea of Ozzy Osbourne being a sleeper agent, and we've rolled our eyes at the teleportation pads in the preschool crawl spaces. But the abyss level of this iceberg actually isn't funny. This is the part where the water turns ice cold and the oxygen runs out. The abyss isn't about what the Satanists did, because, spoiler, they didn't exist. The abyss is about what we did. The most disturbing part of this entire 1,000-foot drop into madness isn't the satanic cults. It's the adults who believe this nonsense. It's the realization that thousands of professionals, doctors, judges, police officers, and parents looked at a complete lack of evidence and chose to believe the impossible anyway. This is a social virus at its peak. We like to think we're rational creatures, but the Satanic Panic proved that if you provide society with a big enough monster, they will happily burn down the neighborhood just to see the smoke. In psychology, it's called mass sociogenic illness or collective hysteria. It's the same software glitch that fueled the Salem witch trials and the Red Scare. It's a literal bug in the human brain. When a group of people become convinced of a threat, they begin to interpret every mundane event as proof. A child's nightmare becomes a repressed memory. A missing cow becomes a ritual sacrifice. A neighbor's black t-shirt becomes a uniform of the damned. The abyss isn't the realization that the monster was actually just our own collective anxiety reflected back at us through a distorted lens. Now, we have to look at the wreckage of the innocent. We're talking about people like the McMartin family, who spent years in a legal meat grinder, or the West Memphis Three, who lost their entire youth to a prison cell. These weren't just legal mistakes. These were human sacrifices offered up on the altar of safety. We were so busy saving the children that we didn't care whose lives we destroyed in the process. The abyss is the silence of hundreds of people who spent decades in prison for crimes that literally, physically could not have happened. But here's the real kicker. The part that should keep you up at night. The panic never actually ended. It didn't disappear. It just changed its clothes. If you look at a modern conspiracy theory, you see the exact same DNA. The underground tunnels, the cabal of elites, the secret symbolism hidden in plain sight, and the protection of our children, used as a shield for absolute madness. It's the same story, just updated for a digital age. As a writer, I see the pattern. It's a recurring plot line in the human narrative. We need a villain to explain why the world feels so scary. Or we have to invent one. We create a them so we can feel like an us. The abyss is the terrifying truth that we are doomed to repeat this cycle because we haven't fixed the self-righteous indignation bug in our own programming. We would rather be right about a nightmare than wrong about the truth. So that's it for the Satanic Panic. A decade of wonder, music, and growth for some of us, myself included, and a decade of absolute manufactured horror for others. Looking back at the 80s, it's easy to feel superior. We think we're smarter now. We have the internet. We have instant fact checking. We have AI. We have better science. But the lesson of this iceberg is that fear doesn't give a shit about your technology. Fear is an ancient, visceral thing that lives in the gut, not the brain. The Satanic Panic wasn't caused by the devil, and it wasn't caused by heavy metal or Dungeons and Dragons. It was caused by us. It was the mirror held up to a society that was so afraid of change that it started seeing demons in the shadows. It was also caused by people who stood to profit from all this fear. The media sold more newspapers and advertising space on TV broadcasts, and the churches put more asses in the seats. Fear drives us. It's how most politicians get elected. Scare the shit out of the general population, then act like you know how to solve the problem, and you too can become president. If you escaped the 1980s with your record collection intact and your mind clear, consider yourself lucky. But keep an eye on the news today. Keep an eye on the stories that people are telling about their neighbors. Because the iceberg is still there, floating just beneath the surface of our civilized world. And the abyss is always looking for new residents. I'm Robert Ferentz, the creator of Chilled Bones. And if you want to read some stories that are actually fictional instead of the ones the government tried to sell you in 1985, head over to chilledbones.com and check out some of my novels, guaranteed to give you a good scare. Link in the description below. Please hit the like and subscribe button for more horror-related content, if you're into that sort of thing. And feel free to leave me a comment. I'd love to hear your opinions. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and for the love of all things holy, don't give up your Black Sabbath records.